Hi everyone, so my name's Joseph, and I'm in my final year at Queen's University. So I want to thank Serene for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I know this is the last presentation, so I want to thank everyone for staying to the end of the day to hear me out. I'll get right into it, and I'll start with, until kind of quite recently, Canada lagged behind most of our allies in national defense mandates and authorizations with respect to offensive cyber. Neither Canadian Armed Forces nor our intelligence community currently engages in offensive cyber operations, and many would argue that this kind of defensive posture doesn't offer either an effective protection or deterrence in the cyber domain. Introduced in 2017 in its second reading in the Senate right now, Bill C-59, an act respecting national security matters, proposes some of the most significant and comprehensive changes to national security laws in recent history. Of the new acts in C-59, this presentation specifically will focus on the CSE Act for Canada's Foreign Signals Intelligence Agency, the Communications Security Establishment, and specifically the proposed authorization for CSE to conduct active cyber operations, which for the rest of this presentation I'll refer to as offensive cyber operations, to maintain consistency with what a lot of our allies refer to and also what a lot of the scholarship refers to. So, as sort of an overview of some of my research, I felt to properly understand the addition of OCOs or offensive cyber to the CSE mandate, it was important to evaluate some of their opportunities and constraints, as well as what the current cyber threat landscape was, in addition to what our allies and adversaries are doing. So I'm going to touch on kind of some key concepts first to give everyone an idea of what exactly I'm talking about, and then I'll progress through my idea of the cyber threat landscape, and then a look at what our allies are doing. And then finally, some key factors that I think are driving the addition of offensive cyber operations to the CSE mandate, as well as some opportunities and constraints that I can see for offensive cyber in the Canadian context. So in terms of the cyber threat landscape, we'll start with some key concepts. So what exactly do I mean by offensive cyber? There's some important distinctions, first of all, to make in terms of the background. So this provides sort of the overview for the general operations in the cyber domain. So under kind of the umbrella of computer network operations, you have computer network attack, computer network exploitation, and computer network defense. And generally, computer network exploitation, for example, is considered to be where cyber espionage or sort of more intelligence-related cyber activities fall, whereas offensive cyber would be considered to be a cyber attack. And there is actually this is important because there's some confusion actually in the scholarship about this. Generally, cyber attacks need some form of exploitation to function. So in order to deliver an offensive payload, you generally need to exploit some form of system first. And that leads to some people considering cyber exploitation or cyber espionage to be a form of offensive cyber. And so specifically in this research and in this presentation, I just want to clarify that I see cyber, I just want to make the distinction that cyber exploitation is separate from cyber attack. And that's because generally the objective of cyber exploitation or cyber espionage is to gather intelligence, is to be covert. So you don't want to expose your exploit. Whereas with offensive cyber, by the nature of carrying out your payload, you're exposing the exploit. And generally, it's a single-use weapon, right? So after you carry out that offensive operation, that exploit ceases to exist. Now moving on to offensive cyber operations. This is the definition that's in Bill C-59. And so this would enable CSE to utilize its capacities and capabilities to actively disrupt, degrade, deny, or interfere with the capabilities of foreign adversaries, which in essence, to dumb it down, is to use Canada's cyber capabilities as weapons. These powers are certainly unprecedented in the Canadian context, and they mark a turning point in the Government of Canada's ability to employ offensive cyber tools to further strategic objectives. Now, in the cyber threat landscape, this table presents some of the most major state-sponsored uses of offensive cyber in the last decade or so. So during this time, the principal cyber threat for states has gradually begun moving from cybercrime to more state-sponsored offensive cyber. And so to reinforce this point, I think there's been an increasingly innovative, you could say innovative use of offensive cyber to target democratic processes, critical infrastructure. Notably in 2015, and attributed to Russia, 300,000 people in Ukraine lost power for a number of weeks. And so these kind of attacks mark a pretty significant turning point in the use of offensive cyber tools to actually carry out some pretty substantial damage on a state. And this has caused significant concern, of course. And so you can see from this table, the pace of cyber attacks has been really quite rapidly increasing. And it's pretty clear to see that of the nations that are engaging in offensive cyber, Russia is really the one that's pushing the mark and is really using its capabilities and showing its willingness to use its offensive capabilities pretty significantly. This is not to say, though, that some Western nations, including our allies in the Five Eyes alliance, have also started to engage in offensive cyber. So most notably, the US, UK, and Australia have admitted to using offensive cyber against Daesh in Syria. And the US has also been attributed to using more serious offensive cyber capabilities against Iran, certainly with Stuxnet, and possibly against North Korea following the hack of Sony Entertainment. Now, on to what our allies are doing. So this is interesting because there's been a change actually with Australia. Now, the Australian equivalent to CSE is actually now not in their defense portfolio anymore. But regardless, this is sort of the breakdown of how our allies are using offensive cyber. So all of our Five Eyes allies, except New Zealand, currently have these capabilities. And the Netherlands this year is a little outlier also. But for a small nation, they actually are one of the most capable cyber actors. And they also currently have cyber capabilities, in addition to legislation that's being developed in Germany and in France. So this is to show that Canada is far from the first Western nation, first Five Eyes nation to add offensive cyber capabilities to the mandates of its intelligence or military bodies. Some lessons can be gleaned from this, notably that I think the structure of offensive cyber in C59 is being modeled after our allies, and it's following that kind of direction, and that this isn't a new path. This has been a path that's charted by friendly states or allied states in the past. So notably, Australia, apart from all of the other Five Eyes nations, has a very similar structure. The structure of their offensive cyber is very similar to that of Canada. And I think to a large degree, offensive cyber in Canada was modeled after the Australian model. And so that's a little bit different now, but initially the ASD and the Australian Defence Forces, similar to Canada, were under the defence mandate. And so they reported in a similar way, they cooperated in similar ways, and the way that their offensive cyber governance was structured is almost exactly the same as it is in the CSE Act. And so initially I classified this as a sort of civilian-military partnership. And you can kind of see this in an element of the CSE Act which adds the D&D CAF as a organization that the CSE is mandated to assist if requested. So to me that signals that this is really designed to be a military-civilian partnership, in contrast to nations like the Netherlands or the US, who have primarily military-driven. So the offensive cyber capabilities mainly reside with the military. Now, looking at sort of the context behind why offensive cyber is added to the CSE mandate. And I found this particularly interesting, and I mainly was able to sort of draw some of these conclusions from looking at parliamentary committee hearings and seeing what people had actually said to parliamentarians and how they had explained these additions. So the first one that I've identified is a need for a more offensive or active cyber posture, as a few people have mentioned here before. So a variety of academic literature and policy studies strongly affirms that passive cyber defense has rarely succeeded in effectively preventing attacks, especially given the increasing sophistication of offensive cyber tools. So you only have to be successful once on the offense, whereas you have to be successful every single time on the defense. In this regard, in parliamentary hearings on C-59, former intelligence officials and military officials asserted that proactive cyber activities authorized to the CSE are necessary for the security of Canadian information systems, and further, the current National Security Intelligence Advisor affirmed that the ability for CSE to be more active in cyberspace would better enable CSE to protect Canadians and fulfill its mandate. Now to the second point, keeping pace with adversaries and allies. So this I see is probably the most important factor driving this addition. In parliamentary hearings on C-59, the current National Security Intelligence Advisor made assertions that the addition of offensive cyber to the CSE mandate would be critical to ensuring CSE is able to keep pace with the evolving and challenging nature of current and future cyber threats. So the key word here is keep pace. Which refers to the notion generally that without offensive cyber capabilities, Canada is at risk of falling behind emerging trends in cyberspace. To this effect, both government officials and actually some of the committee members on this parliamentary committee asserted that the perception that Canada is trailing its Five Eyes allies is problematic. And this is especially given the increasing proliferation of offensive cyber capabilities, which is making it necessary for Canada to develop measures to protect itself and to respond to cyber attacks. Now, former CSIS Director and National Security Intelligence Advisor Richard Fadden added that Canada has been a target of some under-the-radar criticism for our inability to conduct offensive cyber operations. So it appears that among Five Eyes nations, the fact that Canada is an outlier in the context of not possessing offensive cyber actually carries a potential to harm our reputation and our reliability within the Five Eyes alliance. Now, the third kind of driver that I identified is supporting strategic objectives. So to this point, part of what makes offensive cyber such a compelling tool for states is that they're so flexible and adaptable. And this, I'll talk about later, can also be kind of a constraint to offensive cyber, in that there's very little, there's almost limitless potential for how you can use them. And in this way, the adaptability of offensive cyber to diverse operational contexts is incredibly useful tactically and strategically for the Canadian Armed Forces and for the Canadian government generally to achieve its strategic objectives. In this context, offensive cyber can be used to disrupt adversary communications, plant false information, degrade an adversary's confidence in their command and control, and specifically, this can result in higher operational success for Canadian military forces. And this was a feature that was referenced multiple times in these committee appearances, was it seems that the direction that the offensive cyber is moving is sort of in support to Canadian Armed Forces. And so that builds off of that ability for D&D CAF to request assistance from CSE. So references were made by both the Minister of National Defense and the Chief of the CSE regarding the use of offensive cyber in support of Canadian military operations. To me, I think this is, I think from the legal standpoint, the definition of offensive cyber in the CSE Act is broad, and so that can cause some worry as to what the true objectives of offensive cyber are. But I think by looking at sort of what public servants are saying in their testimony to parliamentarians, I think it's clear to see that the objectives for offensive cyber are not extreme to the degree that I think it's possible to imagine, given the way that adversaries use offensive cyber. So I think, to me, the third reason driving kind of this addition is mainly to support kind of existing strategic objectives that Canada has. So now some opportunities and constraints for offensive cyber in the Canadian context. So generally over the course of my research, I came to the conclusion that there's primarily operational opportunities at the cost of governance constraints. So the operational opportunities that I identified are, one, ease of development. So at the technical level, Canada is part of Five Eyes. Sorry, my voice is getting really dry. It's part of Five Eyes intelligence sharing. So this means that we have access to some of the most technologically advanced nations on the planet. So the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network is obviously made up of some of the most powerful nations on the planet: UK, US, Australia, some of the most technologically advanced. So Canada has the opportunity to take advantage of this, of our membership in the Five Eyes, in addition to the fact that Canada is one of the hubs in the world for emerging technologies. So Canada has a significant technological capabilities, has a young workforce, and so there's a huge technical opportunity for Canada to kind of lead the charge in offensive cyber. In addition to that, offensive cyber provides an asymmetric advantage at moderate cost. So what this means is, compared to developing conventional kinetic weapons, you can generate an asymmetric advantage with cyber weapons far cheaper. So instead of going through costly procurement processes, you can see that with the F-35, these are still costly to develop and you still need incredibly advanced skill sets, but comparatively they're much cheaper and they're much more covert. So while a program to procure something like the F-35 is generally very overt, and so everyone sees that we have these capabilities and it kind of acts as a deterrent, offensive cyber capabilities can be developed for cheaper and can be developed entirely in secret. Thank you. So an additional opportunity that I talked about earlier is kind of flexible applications. So as a tool, offensive cyber is incredibly flexible and can be used to constrain or enhance the effects of other capabilities and can be employed as their own form of deterrence. So the US actually, in their cyber policy, uses offensive cyber as a deterrent. So they actually call their offensive cyber policy a deterrence policy. It's unlikely that Canada has the same ability to do this or would want to do this, but it shows the degree to which offensive cyber can be used for tactical applications on the battlefield, for instance, or as a sort of strategic deterrent. Now, so I've been generally promoting the use of offensive cyber and supporting why we should have it, but it's important also to look at some of the key constraints to offensive cyber. So one of the key constraints that I identified is sort of this lack of use clarity. So there's no clear doctrine governing how to use offensive cyber, what to use them for. And like I mentioned earlier, they're incredibly flexible. So it's sort of up to your imagination for what possible applications you can have to offensive cyber. And this can lead to lead to a lack of clarity, frankly, regarding how to use them or why to use them or what the threshold is to use offensive cyber. Now, further to this, and this is sort of a smaller point, but in the CSE Act, the Minister of National Defense has to sign off on the use of offensive cyber tools. But in addition to this, the Minister of Foreign Affairs also has to give their consent. So to me, this signaled that the use of offensive cyber by Canada is a pretty significant event. So it requires sign-off by 2 ministers. And I think a lot of people in this room would know that that's not an easy feat to achieve. And in this regard, I could see that the bureaucracy that requires the use of offensive cyber might limit their use as a tactical response. So if you need to use offensive cyber tools quickly or in a battlefield application or for whatever reason, it would be difficult to get the required bureaucratic sign-off for the use of those. Now, at the same time, that could also be an important oversight mechanism to ensure that the use of offensive cyber is considered from both a national defense perspective and from a sort of geopolitical foreign affairs perspective. So the last two are more sort of broad kind of international law overviews. So generally there's, and this is one of the scariest aspects of offensive cyber, is that there's a complete lack of international governance for offensive cyber. So the all existing human rights laws of armed conflict, they're all designed primarily for kinetic use of force. So in this way, offensive cyber is a gray zone of conflict. And this can this is a huge problem in that it's difficult for states to know what's too far, for states to gauge what the threshold of offensive cyber is. And it's difficult, especially for states that abide by international norms, to know where the red line is and to know not to cross that. And so, to me, this is a significant constraint. So there's a lack of international governance, there's a lack of kind of rules to point to, and there's a lack of governance, especially from international institutions. There's been some movement in this direction, but this is still an area that's very vague. And then the final thing is the possibility of a cybersecurity dilemma. So as more nations acquire offensive cyber capabilities and as the proliferation of offensive cyber continues, you have a risk of, and actually especially that there's such a gray zone and that you can conduct them with a degree of plausible deniability. You run into the problem of everyone having offensive cyber tools and everyone using them against each other, and no one can attribute it correctly back, so no one can react to it. So what you have then is that this can affect kind of collective security. So if everyone is able to engage in these abilities, what does this mean? And especially what does this mean for non-combatants? So as we see, Russia is increasingly targeting democratic institutions and democratic processes, critical infrastructure. So what happens when everyone is shutting each other's power grids off and disabling each other's health and energy infrastructure? Then you're getting into an area where you're no longer having sort of military conflict. It's beyond that point, and you have kind of entire societies that are engaged in this conflict. So to me, this cybersecurity dilemma is kind of a larger problem. But that being said, I think in the current form, it's still important for Canada to at least keep pace with its adversaries, especially actually with its allies and its adversaries. And in that regard, I think it's actually a positive thing that the offensive cyber is being added to the CSE mandate. And I think part of what I want to show in this presentation, that it's important to look at what the current norms for usage of cyber capabilities is in the Canadian government, and how public servants and officials are talking about their usage. And I think that's an important way to look at it, instead of looking to how they're used broadly by our adversaries. So anyways, that's it. Thank you.